Okay, this is Chris Goldthorpe from chrischess.com, and this video is going to be about pawn structure. So let's look at a pawn out there by himself, out in the wilderness with the winds blowing around. Nothing he can do. Where's the pawn's weak spot? Well, of course, no piece guards itself, and pawns are the least valuable. So when you can't get a piece to guard them, sometimes the king has to do it. In a pure pawn ending, often only another king can take it. Here, this pawn cannot move to the square in front of it if there were a black pawn there. You might want to take a look at some of my videos on endgames. There's one which has a discussion of positions arising where two pawns are on the same file up against each other, what is called a ram. When you have a situation like that, then both pawns are immobile. Neither pawn can move. If you're watching this video, you should be well aware that pawns cannot capture going straight forward. Okay, so both of these pawns can only be attacked or defended by a king. They're isolated pawns. Neither pawn will ever capture the other one. And this is a characteristic of the pawns, which we're going to see as we go here. This is one reason why pawns like to be in pairs. When a pair of pawns are side by side, both pawns are guarding the square in front of their partner, so they make a good team. This is sometimes called a pawn phalanx. Pawns are at their best when they are side by side, or when they are able to become side by side when they want to. So this is the pawn phalanx or duo. Now, if you have more than one pawn in the same file, we have a name for that. I'm sure some folks watching already know. If I have two pawns in the same file, it is called a doubled pawn and referred to as if it were only one single entity, a doubled pawn. However, if I had the pawns in two adjacent files, then I call them pawns, plural, but this is called a doubled F pawn, implying that it's worth only one pawn. Often that is the case. This pawn in back is immobile because of his partner here. And this one, if it's blocked, well, then both of them become blocked. So a doubled pawn is normally considered a weakness because neither pawn can guard the other one. There are better and worse ways, though, to have a pawn weakness. If let's say there's a pawn here and it's white's move, to go here or to go here is not so bad. But if we were going to create isolated pawns, that makes it different. Because an isolated pawn can only be guarded by pieces, and if you have no pieces, it can only be guarded by the king. So here, when white does this, he just made all three of these pawns isolated pawns, and the doubled F pawn is just waiting to be captured if black had enough pieces in the right places. Of course, in this position, this is still an easy win for white, who has three pawns against none. But we're just talking about the pawn structure here. The main idea is isolated doubled pawns are worse than doubled pawns that are not isolated. So, let's see, what is a passed pawn? A passed pawn is a pawn that doesn't have to fight with any others on its way to becoming promoted. So let's say there's a king here and a king, black king here, and this one is here, and say this is here and here, here and here. And two of white's pawns are passed pawns. Neither of these two pawns at A2 or B3 could be considered to be passed pawns right now. Although if white had only the A and B pawn here, we could consider this to be what's called a candidate passer. We expect it to become a passed pawn with 2 against 1. But this pawn doesn't have to fight with any enemy pawns. So it wouldn't matter how many pieces, that is, pieces other than a pawn, black had here. If black has no pawn in this area here that I'm indicating, then this is a passed pawn, because this pawn won't encounter it or be stopped by it or bothered by it. So a pawn is a passed pawn if it doesn't have to contend with any enemy pawns on its way to promotion. This pawn is obviously stopped by the black king. However, by our definition, it is still a passed pawn because no black pawns are going to bother it on its way to promotion. So passed pawns, as you might expect, are generally useful. Often you can force your opponent to sacrifice a piece, a rook, or even a queen for what used to be a pawn when you promote it. So there are certain attributes of a pawn's placement on the board, and there's some different types of pawn positions in chess games. So let's look at some of those. Let's see. Here we have a backward pawn. A backward pawn is a pawn which, if it were to move forward, would encounter an enemy pawn. If this black D pawn were to come all the way up to D5 here, the white pawn could capture it. Now, we really don't care what else is going on the board, whether or not either move is good or bad. That's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about pawn structure here, specifically the definition backward pawn. A pawn is considered to be backward if, when it moves forward, it will contend with an enemy pawn, which would have the possibility of capturing it, whether or not that's a good move or not. And no pawn can help that pawn. There's no black pawn that can assist this pawn in going to D5. If black had a pawn on C6 or even C7, it could conceivably get to C6 and help black play D5. But as it is, this is a backward pawn, and it is a backward pawn on an open file. Of course, the D file here is not wholly open because there's a black pawn on it, but it is open for white from his side of the board, so we would call it a half-open file. So this D pawn is a backward pawn because of the E pawn sitting here waiting for it. Here's a different sort of backward pawn. This pawn is not a backward pawn. How come? Because this pawn can help it. Yeah, but there's two white pawns there. Doesn't matter. If he can find one pawn to help him come forward to the place where other pawns could capture him, then it's not a backward pawn. So black's E pawn is not a backward pawn. White's E pawn, however, is, because his F pawn is also past this F3 square, and E4 is where he would encounter resistance from an enemy pawn. So this pawn, even if it became a good move later on for him to sacrifice his pawn or move it to e4, whether it was a sacrifice or not, it's still considered a backward pawn. It wouldn't be if this white pawn here were on f3 or if the pawn on d4 were on d3. Then playing e4, he would be assisted by a pawn. Like I said, whether or not that's a good move, in either case, we don't care. It's just a definition. What is a backward pawn? So sometimes we will have what we call a closed and blocked center. Some of you play the French defense. You might even play the advanced variation. Notice how many diagonals are completely blocked. 1, 2, 3, 4 diagonals going this way are totally blocked, and 2 more going this way. Both of the center files are blocked. This whole rank for black is blocked from one side to the other. So if the queen were to get past the second rank, it would have to go back to go to the other side of the board. This bishop that black has here, his queen's bishop on white squares, is blocked in by this. So this is a bad bishop for black and a good bishop for black. This is the bad bishop for white and the good bishop for white. Although white's bad bishop is much better off than black's bad bishop because it has more space. So this is a closed and blocked center. When it's closed and blocked, it's very hard for either side to change it even if they want to. But in a closed and blocked center, it's not urgent to castle most of the time. Okay, here's another type of closed center, but it's not exactly blocked. Here, if white wanted to sacrifice a pawn, and if he were willing to do that, if it became a good move, he could move this d3 pawn up to d4. Same thing could be said for black. He could move his d6 pawn to d5, and that could result in some more open diagonals and open files or half-open files, more mobility and activity for the pieces for both players. However, usually that's not the case when we see this pawn structure, because there's usually other pieces that make this move difficult for black and this move up here difficult for white. So the center usually remains closed for a long time. If white has a white squared bishop, it tends not to be so good unless he can get it outside the pawn chain. For black, the similar answer exists. His dark squared bishop tends to be a bad bishop unless he can get it outside of his pawn chain here. With a pawn structure like this, that is a closed center, even though it's not blocked, often castling first is a mistake. Now let's look at let's see. Another closed block center. Yeah, this is the same thing as with the French defense, only just with the pieces gone. So you see just the pawn structure. Now, you could have a situation where you get what is called an isolated pawn in the middle of a game. Usually in a game, if one person has an isolated pawn, there's a reason why. So let's do this and show a position where a isolated pawn occurs. This comes from the Queen's Gambit. And now black plays here immediately. This move is considered a little sketchy by modern grandmasters, but we're not concerned about that. We just want to see a situation where there is both positive and negative concerning an isolated pawn, and there almost always is if we see it in a game. Otherwise, the person with the isolated pawn. If it were only a downside to them, they would not have allowed it. White does plan to trade his side pawn for a center pawn by taking, and black can take back. White gets his second knight out. Black develops his knights in alphabetical order, one at a time. Now white is going to fianchetto to make his bishop line up and attack this defended pawn, because this pawn is going to be also isolated, and white is going to put pressure on it by moving his bishop here to g2 and keeping it blockaded. His knight also will be attacking it. Queen b3 may occur as well. Typical for black is to get a piece out, as does white, and then if he moves his knight off, they both castle. And although bishop to g5 is perfectly playable, one of the common moves here for white is to go ahead and trade. He already caused the bishop to make an extra tempo. And if we just look at the pawn structure here, if you're able to block out in your mind everything except the king and the pawns, you'll notice black has an isolated pawn on d5. And so far as that analysis goes up till here, that's bad for black. But what's good for black is we notice that with the bishop on black and this pawn on white, this pawn has more than the usual amount of mobility. He can move all over the place. In fact, he can go here forward and attack white's knight if he wants to. Of course, white's not going to capture that pawn right now because black has two defenders, so he would lose a knight for a pawn. Not good. But this pawn is the only pawn in the center. So, although if we only think about the pawn structure, white is better, well, black also has two files, both the C and the E file, to work with. He has the only pawn in the center, and very often black can cause this pawn to be traded for the E pawn, and then any material imbalance, which there isn't one anymore, would be less dangerous to black. So here, although black has the isolated pawn, he has compensation for it, and normally he does. He's got the only pawn in the center. He's got a lot of piece mobility. Ask yourself which side here, white or black, which side wants to trade minor pieces? White does. White would like this to be a pure queen and rooks ending. Then that weakness of the pawn on d5 would become very evident. But as it is, it's a more equal game, and some of the world's best players have played this from both sides, so it can't be that bad for black. Tirage, whose name is on this opening, this is the Tirage Defense, said, "He who is afraid to play with an isolated pawn should give up chess." But what he might not have told you there is that the isolated pawn by itself, that's still a negative thing. It's just that white has to realize that black has advantages that come along with the disadvantage of having this isolated pawn. So we can expect that in almost every case. For example, let's suppose someone is playing the Ruy Lopez. New game. And so they both start off with very normal moves. He attacks the pawn, black defends. Now the bishop attacks the knight that defends the pawn that his knight attacks. And we'll suppose that he does this and white plays the exchange variation. Well, having a pair of bishops is like an extra half pawn, and yet white seemed not to mind trading his bishop for a completely immobile, trapped, and pinned knight. Further, when black takes, he no longer has a possibility here of having a healthy majority, because his 4 has now been turned into kind of like 3. He has a doubled c-pawn. But black has something in compensation, something to make up for what seems to be bad. He has something good. He has both of his bishops, and they're both free. So they need to be off the back row yet. Just the fact that they are free is helpful to them and leaves white wondering when and where they may come out. So here, black has the plus that he has both bishops, and he has the minus that he has damaged his pawn structure at least a little bit. Okay, let's look at a pawn that's completely alone. There are some factors to discussing that pawn in regard to where he lives. Oh yeah, one of these kings has to be a black one. Okay, so this area behind the pawn is called rear span. Then the shorter distance is the lee side. This is front span, and the luff, L-U-F-F, luff side, which is farther from the nearest side. So naturally, the closer pawns get to each other on the same file, the more likely they are to become completely immobile and blockaded. Just be aware in advance when it's going to happen, and especially when it's going to happen to your opponent. Okay, so pawn structure has been called the heart of chess. So look for a book called Hans Kamak, Pawn Power in Chess. If you haven't already done some studying on positional issues, there's stuff that you can learn from books that you don't see on the internet very much, primarily because people who use books are more serious students. And I invite other people who make videos to make some videos about some more general middle game and end game subjects, such as pawn structure and planning. And look for the video on the Queen's Gambit, playing the Queen's Gambit as black. That's the reason, mostly the reason why I made this video on pawn structure. It'll also help you decide when files can open, but more on that in that discussion. Thanks for listening. This is Chris Goldthorpe with ChrisChess.com.